God, we thank you for opportunities to learn and grow as your children and as your disciples. And we know you're not through with us yet. So bless this time and continue, oh God, to help us to grow and help us to be open to your Spirit to be at work in us and through us. So bless this time and help our hearts to be open and our minds too. In Jesus' name, all God's people say, amen.
Thank you, Tom. Like many of you, I grew up going to church. Church is a very formative part of my life, my development of my own identity and sense of mission. And like many of you, I have questions about exactly what the role of the church will be for people in the future. My graduate degree is in church history, so I tend to think historically about questions that are contemporary. And so what I want to do today is look at a couple of different generations of perspectives on church home, and then to try to make some predictions based on that, on changes that churches are going through today in order to still be a church home for people. And the way I want to get at this is to look at the difference in my grandfather's understanding of church, my father's understanding of church, and my adult children's understanding of church, which is dramatically different, all three of these very different generations. So let me talk first about my grandparents' understanding of church and church home. And the reason for getting at this church home is that historically, home has done two things for us. It's told us what our identity is and what our mission is. Those were things that came to us as an inheritance. It wasn't really an option. That sounds kind of foreign now. Now, my kids would say home is something that you leave in order to figure out for yourself who you are and what you are about. But it used to be that your identity and your mission was part of your inheritance. That was certainly the case for my grandparents, to a lesser degree to my parents, and not at all to my kids. And the degree to which church is a church home, that's been part of the confusion. What is the church's role in helping us understand identity and mission? So those are the questions I'm trying to get at in our 40 minutes together. So first, my grandparents. In the stairwell of our home, the walls are filled with black and white photographs from my wife's side of the family and my side of the family. All of these large black and white photographs that we put up there are our ancestors. They go back 6 generations. All of mine are from the same North Carolina tobacco farm that each of the people in these photos inherited from the people in the previous photo. And they're all taken on the same porch, beat up porch of this beat up farm in North Carolina. As a kid, my parents would send my brothers and me to work on the farm. I have absolutely no sentimental notions about getting back to the good life on the farm. It was hard work. I couldn't wait to go back to suburbia at the end of the summer. But when you look at these photos, I mean, it's hard to tell where the farmer stopped and the farm starts. These are all people who belong on a farm. That farm had taken over their identity. There's one picture that we also have up on the wall that's different from all of the other ones, and that is of my grandfather as a young man, and he is sitting on a crescent moon holding a saxophone. When I got these pictures from my aunt, I said, "What is this?" This picture was not taken in Tarboro, North Carolina. This picture was taken in Miami, Florida. And I said, I never heard anything about Granddaddy hanging the moon in Miami, Florida. And she says, oh, he didn't talk much about that. She says, your grandfather was a young man, he had this dream of playing in the big bands. And sure enough, when he got old enough, he hitchhiked down the county road to the paved road, as they called it, and then made it all the way to Miami, auditioned, and sure enough, got a job with one of the big bands. I said, well, you go, Granddad, that's fantastic. She says, oh, he didn't last long. He said he was only with the bands for about 6 weeks, and he found that life on the road was filled with loneliness, alcoholism, and women who scared him. So as soon as he could, the prodigal came back to the farm that he never again left until he died, happily. Now, this is the significance of that little story. Before my grandfather ever tried to leave home and chase this dream of playing with the big bands, his identity, his mission in life had already been given to him. It was given to him by his parents and his grandparents who lived in the same house, by aunts and uncles who lived in farmhouses down the road, by his Sunday school teacher who was the same person as his public school teacher, by the preacher of the Rocky Mount Baptist Church, by his lifelong girlfriend, my grandmother, who said she wouldn't marry him until he got this full idea out of his system about joining the bands. And in the only time in his otherwise very purposeful, meaningful life that he tried to be somebody other than who his home and his home church told him he was, the only time he tried to do that was the time that he was confused, uncertain about who he was. He then returned home, not because life on the farm was particularly fulfilling. When I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do for a living, my grandfather had died, but I asked my grandmother, was Granddaddy fulfilled as a tobacco farmer? And she kind of cocked her head the way my dog does when he's confused. Like, she didn't really know what I meant. I had to explain the concept of fulfillment. And then finally she said, I don't know, sweetie, he was a farmer. Which was fascinating to me. It never occurred to him in his life to ask himself, all those years going to the back 40 acres, if this was fulfilling to him. He just did it because that's what he did. Now, I did a research project on the preaching that was done at the turn of the 20th century and into the first couple of decades, which is when my grandfather was an adult and making his life choices. And I looked at the sermons that had been preserved from that time. The subject that was preached on the most during my grandfather's day in church was heaven. And the place in heaven always had a particular location. It was located up ahead. It's up ahead waiting for us in the future. And the typical sermon outline would be, I know that life is hard and difficult now, but if you just fulfill your responsibilities, someday the Heavenly Father who's waiting up for you on the shores of heaven will receive you and say to you, well done, good and faithful servant, come and enter your eternal reward. That sermon was said in many different ways, but basically that same kind of message, because life was difficult. At the beginning of the 20th century, half of American homes still had no indoor plumbing. Life expectancy was 54. Few people had pensions. The work week was 60 hours, and women worked a lot more than that. There was no leisure industry in my grandparents' day because there was no leisure. It was a hard, difficult life. And Some had the difficulty of life in the agrarian life, like my grandparents. Others were living in difficult intercity, ethnic neighborhoods, but they had a sense of what their home was. You knew where your home was. You settled into that place. A lot of in places like Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, they still have remnants of these ethnic neighborhoods. And you would leave the apartment perhaps and get another apartment, but you never really left the neighborhood. And in the neighborhood, that's where the restaurants that served food from the old country could be found. And churches would be there that would worship in the language of the old country, and they'd bring priests over who could conduct the service in the language that was known back in the European countries or Asian countries. All places of inculcating identity and mission, hard work. This is who you are. This is who. That all began to change in my father's generation. Around the middle of the 20th century, or actually just before we get to the middle of the 20th century, technology, education, commerce, government, all became unwitting partners in inviting my father's generation to leave the farm or to leave the old urban ethnic neighborhoods. My father and his peers took advantage of a brand new thing called the GI Bill. And they used that to get a college degree. It never occurred to my grandfather that his sons or daughters would have a college education. That was something that rich people got. But with the GI Bill, my uncles, my aunts, my father, all were able to get a college education at another relatively new thing called the land grant university. When they got their degrees, they then got jobs with another new thing called the multinational corporation that invited them to leave the farm, the ethnic neighborhoods, and live in another new social phenomena in America called the suburb, which had avenues that all went one way and streets that went the other way. And the people who lived there never really forgot where home was, that first generation in the suburbs. So they were, if you will, exiles. Exiles are people who don't live at home, who may never be returning home, but they know where home is. That was my parents. They really liked their home in the suburbs. My mother was crazy. She used to refer to it as her all-electric home by GE. I had so many conveniences that my grandmother did not have. But every time Christmas came around, they would throw my brothers and me in the back of the station wagon and say, we're going home for the holidays. And so we would go back to the farm just as a place to visit. They had no desire to actually live there. But they knew so there was still a sense of identity because their home was back. They're a place that they came from. But they were very comfortable in their planned communities. Now, churches during this period, during my parents' generation, during the 50s and 60s, church attendance exploded in America. If you're in the field of American church history, you can build an entire career writing essays about what's called the attendance bubble in the 50s and 60s. That's when churches all across this place were packed. And we all have their different kind of theories as to why attendance was higher during the 50s and 60s than it has been at any time in the history of the church in this country. A lot of people think that in colonial times, it's when everybody went to church and then attendance has just kind of gotten worse over time. That's not true. In colonial times, we checked from parish records, attendance was less than 20% on a typical Sunday. In the 1950s and 60s, attendance in church was between 50 and 60% of Americans were in a house of worship on Sunday during this period of time. Unbelievably high attendance. When I am talking to our seminarians who are getting ready to graduate, One of the things that they will often find when they are interviewing for a job is someone in the church will say to them, well, you know, when Reverend Smith was here back in 1960, this place was packed. And you look promising. I'm sure you're going to get all those people back, just like Reverend Smith had here. Well, it wasn't because of Reverend Smith that the place was packed. Every church, all you had to do was open the doors. Every church was packed during that time. Why? Why was that so, so important? Protestant denominations in the 50s and 60s got very large at the same time that corporations got big and at the same time that government got big. They had home offices in New York. They would have branch offices out in the suburbs. Why did all that happen? I have my own theory about it. And that theory is, as nice as it was to have these matching avocado kitchen appliances, the people in my parents' generation knew that they were created for something else. And they were looking for ways of lifting their eyes up for holy purposes. Their parents found holy purpose through heroic, sacrificial, hard living. Life in the suburbs wasn't heroic. And so they were looking for ways of recovering life under heaven. I also looked at the sermons from the 50s and 60s, which again were frequently, there were sermons about heaven. Interestingly, the preachers relocated heaven. No longer were they talking about heaven waiting up ahead in the future. Where do you think they put heaven? 50s and 60s. They put it above us. All of the sermons talked about heaven above us, life under God. In fact, we inserted in 1954 into the Pledge of Allegiance that we would be a nation under God. That's, again, classic language, vertical thinking, ordered language, life under heaven. This generation were big people of duty and responsibility and order. That's one of the ways that they tried to fulfill their responsibilities. They liked rules. My brother said that my parents actually never met a rule they didn't like. Because it was how you fulfilled your responsibility. In my grandfather's day, the Presbyterian Book of Order was small enough to fit in a man's shirt pocket. In my parents' day, the Presbyterian Book of Order swelled to the 2-volume thing that we have now. That was because this generation likes rules. When I would preach sermons, and people of my parents' generation would be in the service, if I got too much into existential themes, or a sermon that was talking about being caught between how it is and how it ought to be, and the ambiguities of life, this generation would just glaze over. And one of them one time said to me, you know, I was a little lost today in that message. And I was just trying to figure out, do you need more Sunday school teachers? Is that what you were asking for? Because I can do that. Because that's what they know, duty, responsibility. And these sermons about life under heaven was not just about life in the church as being under heaven. Very typically in my parents' generation, your Sunday school teacher could be your public school teacher or your Boy Scout or Girl Scout leader or your football coach, and was expected to pray before all of these things. We didn't talk about the separation of church and state in the 50s and 60s. No one cared about that. It was all about good citizenship. You were expected to be good citizens. And one of the functions of church was to help create good citizens. It was also a purpose of education. When I was a kid, I would bring home my report card. I got graded in elementary school on the classics, math, social studies, science, and citizenship. I got a citizenship grade every time. It just seems odd now, doesn't it? But, and it wasn't always a good grade either, come to this, you know? But that was just part of what was, we were creating good citizens. All, again, life under heaven. And the suburbs had a certain order to them. Again, the avenues went one way, the streets went another way. These were planned communities, all a way of giving order to God. That's, again, classic exilic behavior, trying to represent the your true home. So the true home was your heavenly home, not just the old farm or the ethnic neighborhood. And you tried to live under that. Okay, grandparents, parents, I'm getting ready to move to my kids. Anybody have questions? You still with me, tracking? And the role that the church played and all of that? All right. If I had to describe my grandparents as people who kind of settled for what they were given, as hard as it was, my parents as people who thought of heaven as being above them, and they were exiles from that. I would have to talk to about my kids, one of whom's a millennial, and the other ones are Gen, what's that next, X. They're nomads. Nomads don't really have any idea where home is, and they're really okay with that. They typically, they and their friends would have made maybe 3 moves before they went to college. When I was working on some of this research project, I was interviewing my daughter, who was in college at the time, and her friends about where home was. And they got tired of me asking questions because they felt judged by the question, because they didn't really know where home would be. Because if you've moved, because your baby boomer parents moved you 2 or 3 times trying to get better jobs along the way, and where would you say home is by the time you're in college, particularly if your parents have made yet another move while you're in college. So they had a very hard time answering the questions. They would say things like, well, home is where I hang my hat, or home is where my friends are, or something sentimental like that. But they wouldn't say, well, Minneapolis or San Diego or Austin. No, because they lived there for 3 or 4 years on their way to some other place. And they've grown up in a world that has no borders to them. I mean, it was unimaginable to my grandfather that his kids would leave the farm. It's unimaginable to my kids that they would stay in one place. They've traveled easily and often. When my daughter was studying abroad, she was studying in Florence for 1 semester, at least that's what she told her mother and me. And one day she got up, this is a completely unremarkable story unless you were my grandfather. One day she got up, decided she didn't want to go to class in Florence. She wanted to go to Budapest. I know Lindsay well enough to know this was just that hit her at breakfast. I'm going to go to Budapest today. And she could. So she got on a train and she went to Budapest. When she got to Budapest, she went to an ATM, got money out of her bank account that I put in there, used that money to go to an internet cafe where she had coffee, and sent a note to her closest friend who was studying in Brazil that semester. Again, a completely unremarkable story. Many of you have had kids who've studied abroad, had stories just like this, but think about how that would rock my grandfather's boat, that story. Like getting money from an ATM, he never got money from a machine in his life. And an internet cafe, what is that? And how can you be writing a note to your closest friend if she's in Brazil? That's not close. And what the heck are you doing in Budapest anyway? So even when I was growing up, the world was divided between good places and bad places. And there was a wall up, an iron curtain that was up that divided the world. And the story we told on this side of the wall was they have to have that wall up because it's so bad over there that people are trying to get out. But if you grew up on the other side of the wall, they said the reason we have this wall is because it's so bad in the West that we have to protect you from people trying to get in here. And so they had these competing mythologies or stories that divided the world between good places and bad places. My kids have grown up in a world that has no division between good places and bad places. They can travel everywhere. And I think that's actually their plan, to travel everywhere. But they're at home nowhere. They have no place that they would say, this is where home has to be. Therefore, the questions of identity and mission are pressing for them. And pressing, I think, for the church today as well. Home is now something that, whatever it is, you leave in order to figure out for yourself who you are. And it all comes through the call to make choices. Anyone who's done parenting the last couple of generations knows that all of the advice that we give parents is to help kids make good choices. So that when Johnny throws a rock and it goes through the window, you're not supposed to go out and scold or punish Johnny. You're supposed to bring him in and show him the rock and the broken glass and say, now, Johnny, was this a good choice? And Johnny, who's a smart little boy, is, I'm thinking, no, that wasn't a good choice. Right, that's very important. You understand that. Well, as Johnny gets older, there's more at stake about Johnny's choices. And so we try to get other people to help Johnny make better choices. We bring Johnny to youth group. We try to make sure Johnny has other friends who are making good choices because we're really nervous about Johnny and his choices. And then it all comes to a head when Johnny has to make choices about going to college. And any of you who've been through this lately, you know that this is like the most stressful thing a family unit goes through is Johnny and trying to get into college. And that goes through all of the drama of trying to get into the right school. And when we went through this, the heads of the school would bring all of the parents in and they would make it clear that this is not the parents' choice. This is Johnny's choice. Johnny gets to make this choice. You get to pay for it, but Johnny gets to make this, it's Johnny's choice. Then Johnny is struck by this choice. What if the school that he chooses doesn't choose him? They have reach schools and safety schools, and God help you if you find out that your reach school is someone else's safety school. And somehow we get through all of this mess and we get these kids finally get into a school. And what's the first thing that we say to them? But pick a major. Only they don't think they're picking a major, they think they're picking a life. But they're 18 or 17 even. And who knows what your life is going to be like when you're 18 or 17? Not a lot of us. Some do, but not a lot. But they think they're picking a life. And so they say, all right, well, I got to pick a major. Well, there are those great doctor shows on TV. I'll be a doctor. It's very easy. You just got to, on the registrar's website, you look up majors and you type in pre-med. I'm going to be a doctor. Then they take biology 101 and they realize I'm not going to be a doctor. It's not a problem. You just get back on the registrar's website. Delete, 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 delete. Okay, what else am I going to do? Well, there are good lawyer shows on TV too. They make good money. I'll be a lawyer. Pre-law, hit, submit. In 15 minutes, they think they've changed the trajectory of their life from medicine to law, and it was all their choice. Watching my kids through college, I discovered you can do this 2 or 3 times. Then this is what's fascinating as I've continued to watch them. After they graduate from college, the mindset of being able to pick a life stays with them. So then it's just pick a job, pick any job you want. Not like my grandfather will tell you what your job is. You pick a job, pick any job. I remember saying this myself quite a bit. Just pick a job. Benefits would be good. And so they pick a job, but if they don't like the job, again, that mindset of the registrar's website stays with them. They should be able to pick again. And then they can pick again, they can pick again. And if you don't like your church, you don't like your community, you don't like your circle of friends, you don't like your partner, you should just be able to pick again and choose again and choose again. And so what pastors are discovering about their parishioners is how many of us are using up our fleeting years, constantly trying to make choices to find a life that we will like. When actually what we're doing is just kind of rearranging the furniture, thinking that by choosing, we can choose our way into a life. So what is that? How does that impact church? It means that when people come to church now, they're viewing church not as an integral part of their life, but as a resource in the quest to self-construct life. So because now if there's a sense of identity and mission, it's up to each individual to find that on their own. And so they're trying out this church. Will this church help me put my life together? Will it help my family stay together? Will it be a good place for us to raise our kids? Will it be a place that will address the concerns I have about life in our country or in the world? People have different affections, which is why there's so much debate about from one church to another, and why we debate about things like music and worship styles, because again, we're trying to find something that will help assemble a particular life. The fascinating thing about the heaven piece is, I told you my grandparents' day, it was always located in the future. And my parents' day, it was always located up ahead. It's real easy to do research on sermons now because most preachers put them online. And so you can do searches with some ease. It is very hard to find any sermons about heaven anymore. They've just disappeared. Hymns disappeared. Even theologies, we are not preaching. It isn't that people don't believe in heaven anymore. It's just that it's just not a subject of great concern. The concerns are about the church's relevance to questions in society, questions of justice, or questions of, again, the individual life or the family life and the quest to somehow put it together in some way. But again, if you're nomadic, you don't really care that much about a heavenly home because you're just making your way through this journey that has a beginning and an end, but not necessarily a center place. Now, there are lots of exceptions to that, and every time I talk about this, I end up finding someone in the audience who said, "I've always lived in this town. I don't know what you're talking about." Right, but the average American moves 15 times in the course of his or her life. And many of those moves are made in the pursuit of a particular career. Questions about that? Why the pressures on church are what they are today, and how different it is when church is thought of as resource rather than inheritance. Yeah.
Feels like you slid over your generation.
Yeah, you notice that. Yeah. My generation of baby boomers are the second generation of the people who grew up in the suburbs. And my parents viewed the convenience of life in the suburbs as an opportunity for more service. They were very service oriented, my parents. Both parents were. It's amazing how many service organizations in this country emerged during the 50s and 60s, like Kiwanis Club or Rotary Club or Elks Club, because in addition to your work, you tried to do something to be of service to the community. My mother was a part of a generation of people who also saw an opportunity for service in ways that my grandparents didn't have. because of all those time-saving devices in my mother's kitchen, she didn't have to spend her whole day in the kitchen like her mother did. And so she became a part of another career that was born called the church volunteer. And so my mother was a part of the women's association at her church. And these women's associations for various churches took off in the 50s and 60s. They swelled, they became very big events because the women had the time to be of service to their churches. I remember when my mom brought home a crock pot. I mean, she got all weepy-eyed. You just put the food in it and leave. She said it was remarkable. And well, that allowed her then to go be of service. My generation grew up with all those conveniences and saw them for their own benefit, not so much necessarily to be of service. And so the boomers were a generation that took advantage of what the parents had provided. We were able to build on the economy that our parents had built. And so our lives became more lucrative, by and large, more comfortable. And we saw these benefits and blessings for their own sake and for the sake of what they provided our families. Very often our nomadic kids grew up seeing that, but didn't necessarily embrace the same values that the boomer parents had. And so my kids, for example, none of my 3 kids expect to do as well financially as their parents do. And most of their friends don't expect that either. No, I think they're underselling themselves. I'm like, oh yeah, you're gonna do great. But by and large, that's true generationally across the boards. And so it isn't that they're discouraged or despairing. They just don't actually, they're not that worried about that either. Even the graduates of our seminary they're planning on doing some type of ministry, but they're not very anxious about it. And they're not dying to get a job the way that my generation was. When I was graduating from seminary, by the time we got to graduation, I didn't know anybody who didn't have a job somewhere. In fact, I was already signed up in the Presbyterian pension plan a month before graduation. That was just we were very career oriented. That's what boomers are, very career oriented. Our current generation students are not. They will find their way into some type of effective ministry, but they're not particularly interested in a career track. We graduate more Presbyterians than we admit at the seminary. That's because, but we also graduate more Episcopalians and more Lutherans than we admit. Again, that's because even our graduates view denominations as a resource, and they'll choose their denomination while they're at seminary, again, putting their own ministry together their own way. Yeah.
Could you please address the change in church attendance from the high point in the 50s and 60s and how it's declined since, and what you attribute that to?
Church attendance was a part of a larger meta-narrative about what it meant to be an American. These are things that you did. You were good citizens. You had a particular kind of family. The embodiment of this family would be like the Cleaver family, where Ward would go off to work doing something, and June stayed home and cooked with her pearls on, and she would come home and June would say something about what mischief the beaver got into today, and Ward would roll his eyes and he would go out and say something, and they would all get straightened up in 30 minutes because of the wisdom of Ward. And they lived, and that was kind of that narrative. That narrative started falling apart, and it fell apart because we didn't account for everybody. It was very monolithic in terms of its expectation of what life looked like. It didn't account for people of color. It didn't account for people who weren't married. It didn't account for women who were working outside of the home. And so as that narrative started falling apart, people began to realize that values were preferential, not prescribed. And if values are preferential, then religious values are preferential as well. That then led to what some sociologists call the secularization thesis, meaning that we realize that you don't have to have religion in order for a society to hold together. It's preferential. You can choose it, you cannot choose it. Society will still hold together. The church that I served, at one point when I was in Washington, D.C., it's called National Presbyterian Church, was built as a temple to civil religion. It was one of the last ones. And if you ever in DC and you look at National Presbyterian Church, it looks like a temple to civil religion. It's built of marble. It has a court of flags. It has stained glass windows in the chapel of the presidents, and all of the people in the stained glass windows are American presidents, not saints. It has a big eagle on the chapel pulpit, which is not the Gospel of John eagle, it's the American eagle. It has Ronald Reagan's pew in a glass case. It has the prie-dieu, the kneeler, where Dwight Eisenhower knelt because he was the only sitting president to be baptized. And they bolted to the ground as if someone would take that. But it was all like, and that church was built in a day where political leaders had to go to church to still be elected. And so the ushers had all these protocols for how to greet the limos when the senators would pull up, because you had to be seen in church. That is no longer by any stretch of the imagination the case, that a political leader has to be seen as religious to get elected. So all of that began to fall apart, again, because we realized that religious values were preferential. I think we have time for one quick one. Yes.
You mentioned the president's pictures in stained glass windows. That's sort of politics, but how do you keep the politics out of churches? How do you deal with this stuff that's, coming in on churches and schools and all of this? How does the church itself, how you run the church and whatever, keep out of it? I wondered about how deep is it? How do you keep out of it?
Again, it gets back to preference.
It's a place to go.
It comes back to preference. And some people are very much hoping that their preachers are going to wade right into political issues. Given what happened with the Supreme Court this week, some preachers rewrote their sermons in order to wade right into that, because that's what people were hoping they would do. I'm a guest preacher. I'm not going anywhere near it. That's just not good hospitality. But other preachers, that's exactly what they want. And the people who go to those churches go because that's what they're looking for. Others don't want that in the pulpit. They don't want it in their church at all. And so they go to churches where they don't have that. Again, that's because the church now is having to market or present itself as a resource to what people want in the construction of their own lives based on their own preferences. I don't know that that's all bad. I just know that churches need to be clear about that, know who their market is, and not be afraid of this kind of language, by the way. Know who the market is and know how to appeal to that particular market if they want to be attracting people into their pews. Thanks for letting me walk through some of this with you. I know that we're out of time. I've really enjoyed having a chance to think through this with you. God bless you. Take care.